I'm joined here today on TVP World by Yevgenia Kara-Murza, the wife of the champion freedom fighter, champion of human rights in Russia, who's been imprisoned, Vladimir Kara-Murza. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
And now, I guess for our viewers, if you might tell us exactly how your husband found himself in the current situation that he's in, imprisoned in Russia.
That would be a long story, because my husband has been in the opposition to the current Russian regime for as long as this regime has been in power. And since 2010, my husband has been actively involved in the advocacy for the introduction of the Magnitsky Law around the world. This legislation implies the imposition of targeted personal sanctions, Magnitsky sanctions, against human rights violators. And this campaign was born after the assassination of Sergei Magnitsky in a Moscow prison in 2009. So since the launch of this campaign, my husband has been very active, advocating for the use of targeted Magnitsky sanctions against human rights violators in Russia. And today this legislation exists in 35 countries. And of course, this is something that the regime did not like at all. So my husband was targeted for assassination twice in the past, in 2015 and 2017. And an independent journalistic investigation by Bellingcat, The Insider, and Der Spiegel showed that both times my husband had been followed by the same team of FSB operatives, a team of assassins in the service of the Russian state, who poisoned Alexei Navalny with Novichok and who had followed Boris Nemtsov before his assassination. But, you know, I have to know my husband to understand his position. He said that 2 assassination attacks definitely meant that he was doing something right and that this work needed to continue. And he, of course, continued being very vocal about the crimes committed by the regime against the Russian population and against our neighbors. And since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, he's been very vocal, denouncing the crimes committed by the Russian army there and calling for the international tribunal. And so he was arrested in 2022, and in 2023, exactly a year after his arrest, he was sentenced to 25 years of strict regime. There were 3 criminal cases against him. For the last 8 months, he's been kept in solitary confinement in a so-called special regime prison colony in Western Siberia. You
mentioned the 2 assassination attempts and your husband saying, well, that means that he must be doing pretty good. We've all seen Alexei Navalny return to Russia after his poisoning, most likely in the same thought, I believe, as your husband. We've seen what's happened to Alexei Navalny. We see your husband's in prison. How should Russians protest this regime? Should they do it inside of Russia? Is it better to oppose the criminal Putin regime from outside of Russia? What is your opinion on that?
I think that everything should be done to weaken the regime in the Kremlin, but I definitely would not give advice to Russians in Russia, in the country, about ways to protest. Because I understand what risks they're running. I understand what challenges they're facing, and I see that, you know, according to Ovidinfo, an independent media project that monitors political persecution in the country, from January 1st to May 5th of this year alone, 970 people were detained during public events across the country, which means that roughly 8 people are being detained per day. And the number of political prisoners is growing at an astonishing rate. So which means that people still protest, even though these are not mass protests. These are usually solitary protests or solitary acts of defiance, putting anti-war graffiti on walls, spreading information, donating money to Ukraine, doing anything really, setting conscription centers on fire. very often these forms of protest, these protests are taking the form of partisan acts. But they are ongoing, and the number of people who are being detained shows that. But there is a lot of potential outside of Russia as well, and there is a huge number of organizations, all of which have direct links to people on the ground in Russia. And I work with one such organization. I'm advocacy director at the Free Russia Foundation. We are a civil society organization that helps encourage, promote, and support different pro-democracy and anti-war initiatives and organizations and projects. And we work with many such projects who have not only representation, but who work mainly in Russia, on the ground. All of these people, they have a lot of activities still being led on the ground in Russia. So I believe that we need to work together. And I don't believe that we can afford losing hope, but I think that hope has to be productive. We cannot just sit on the couch and hope for something to happen, for the situation to change. It's not going to change if we don't do anything to change it. So I think that hope should be productive, but I believe that if political prisoners in today's Russia can keep their spirits, can keep their hope behind bars in impossible conditions in which they're serving these absolutely atrocious sentences, and I'm not just talking about my husband, they're even according to very conservative estimates by Memorial, the number of political prisoners in the country is over 700 people nowadays. And again, Memorial representatives themselves say that this number is very conservative because they just don't have the hands to go through all the cases that they receive at the rate they receive it. So I believe that if these political prisoners can keep their spirits and can send us words of encouragement, we just simply don't have the right to give up.
Certainly. Now, President Zelensky has just recently said that the West does not want Ukraine to be victorious because they're afraid of what's going to happen to the Russian state should it collapse, should it disintegrate as a result of a Ukrainian victory. But from the eyes of the opposition, from your standpoint, do you think that fear of a Russian disintegration needs to be considered and allowed, perhaps, by the West?
I think that the West should also decide what vision of Russia would be acceptable. If we're talking about the regime of Vladimir Putin being replaced by another regime, that's one thing. And if we talk about the only way for this continent to be stable and secure and peaceful is for Russia to be a democracy, that's a different matter. And I believe that different methods should be used to achieve the goal here. So I believe that, in my opinion, I'm not a politician, I'm just a Russian citizen. But I understand that the only Russia that will no longer pose a threat to itself and its neighbors is a democratic Russia. And I believe that the potential for the democratic Russia is there. It exists. And this is why Vladimir Putin is using the full might of the state repressive machine to try and destroy this potential right before your eyes. And I believe that if the world wants to see that Russia, wants to see a democratic Russia, that part of Russian civil society that represents that vision, that carries that vision, that fights for its vision, and that risks their lives and their freedom for that vision, the West should support it and show solidarity with that part of Russian civil society.
Some would say that also that President Zelensky's 10-point peace plan is the only way that there can be major positive democratic change in Russia. Should that be a non-negotiable to when this war is concluded?
This full-scale invasion is the result of the impunity that Vladimir Putin has enjoyed over the years. I mean, it is not the first time he invades the territory of a sovereign state. There was the invasion of Georgia in 2008. That's over 10 years ago. And there was the annexation of Crimea in 2014. And the response of the West to those invasions was not strong enough. And nor was its response to the violent squashing of peaceful protests that were happening in Russia over all of these years, over 2 decades, even though international documents clearly state that human rights violations cannot be considered an internal affair of any state. And other states have the responsibility to act if such human rights violations are happening. And they have the responsibility to punish those responsible for those acts. Nothing of the kind was ever done with regard to Vladimir Putin. So naturally, he ended up believing that he could get away with anything. And he invaded Ukraine. So yes, if he's allowed a way out of this, if he's allowed to represent something as a victory in this war, as his victory in this war, aggression will continue, warmongering will continue, and obviously repression in the country will continue.
One more question before we finish. You mentioned in your address to the conference here, to the Strategic Ark, you mentioned the foreign agents law. We've seen the protests in Georgia. What impact do you think that the passing of the foreign agents law in Georgia is going to have on its society?
Just look at what is happening in Russia. Anyone who opposes the official narrative is being portrayed by the Russian authorities as extremist traitors, spies, foreign agents, or insane people. So this piece of legislation, that legislation actually exists in some democracies to make the work of some organizations more transparent, but in the hands of authoritarian rulers, in the hands of people who are not very, whose interests are not very democratic, this legislation becomes a powerful weapon that can be used against its own citizens to label them as spies, because foreign agent, that's basically a spy, to label them as spies, to portray their activities as somehow undermining national security or whatever of the state, damaging the image of the state on the international arena. So I'm very happy that protests in Georgia continue. I am sorry that its aspirations to join the European Union has been thwarted by this law, by the legislation, and by everything that's going on around it. I do not believe that this is the end of it. We see that protests continue, and I hope that they are able to defend their democracy now, because I see how creeping authoritarian rule can be, how it starts with small things. You know, in Russia, the foreign agents law was adopted years ago, and then over the years, it was being perfected, you know, to make it, to turn it into a true repressive mechanism.
And now it's been perfected.
And well, it's
in Russia.
It's fine now. Mm-hmm. You know, now they can just take it and use it as a very effective tool. And I hope the same thing doesn't happen in Georgia.
Yevgenia Kara-Murza, thank you very much for joining us on TVP World today. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.